The topic for today is obesity reversal using mitochondria-targeting drugs. Whether discussing metabolic function or cancer treatment, the focus is increasingly on the engine and powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondrion.
It really is, Brendan. It's good to see you again after a couple of weeks. And in each one of these sessions, as we always say, we take a deep dive into recent research that brings to light objective scientific evidence on the topic at hand. And today we're going to look more closely at obesity reversal utilizing mitochondria targeting drugs. Interesting. It has been known for some time that mitochondrial dysfunction, of course, is a key factor that's responsible for many metabolic diseases, probably all, it's involved in all of them, such as obesity, of course, and type 2 diabetes. And the mitochondrion is the principal organelle for the production of ATP. That's the that's the gasoline that goes into the engine for the cell. So here's the question: can the targeting of this organelle result in obesity reversal? Well, let's look at the evidence in this review of a number of articles again on the topic because
Science matters. I sure love talking about mitochondria, so this will be a good time. But before we jump into today's subject, first, after our last broadcast where we talked about ultra-processed foods and systemic health, there were a few questions that came to our attention, one of which was, how do ultra-processed foods cause obesity?
well, they do. And I should tell you, this is going to be a little longer than we normally do because we had a lot of questions. There were a lot of
Mhm.
people wanted to know what's going on. This is a major topic which needs to be addressed. And anyone who is involved in health, wellness, etc., really needs to understand all of this. Look, UPFs, those are ultra processed foods, and I'm going to call them UPFs, tend to be energy dense and they're high in saturated and trans fats, all the stuff they shouldn't be, added sugars and sodium to boot. Consumption of these products may promote excess energy intake because of their high energy density. So the UPFs are entirely altered and have a high level of these very unhealthy fats, the refined sugars and the salts. In addition to all of these wonderful things, they undergo industrial processes like hydrogenation, additives like dyes, stabilizers, emulsifiers, defoaming agents. I'm telling you, just reading and saying this, because I wrote these down, is frightening. And we're taking all this in. So please note that many of these UPFs are foods that we love to eat. Yes, of course. These include soft drinks, candy, ice cream, sweetened breakfast cereals, packaged soups, chicken nuggets, hot dogs, and fries. Is everybody getting the message? In fact, what has become the typical, I say this again, we're trying to joke, but it's not a joking matter. The typical Western diet, which is frequent, large meals, high in refined grains, in red meat, unhealthy fats, sugary drinks, plays one of the largest roles in obesity. There's a reason we have an obesity epidemic in North America. Hello, of course, no surprise. So let me also say that a very recent study in Neurology, the journal, shows the threat posed by UPFs specifically as it relates to the brain. The researchers analyzed all kinds of data from a large cohort, examining the dietary habits and the brain health of thousands of participants over several years. And the findings were striking. Not happy news, but they were very striking. Number one, cognitive decline. Participants with higher UPF consumption exhibited a more rapid decline in cognitive function, including memory, attention, and executive function. That's very frightening. This suggests that UPFs may accelerate brain aging and impair cognitive abilities. That's not bad enough. Number two, brain structure changes. They did MRI scans. What did they reveal? That individuals with diets high in UPFs had significant changes in brain structure. So it's the structure in the MRIs. These changes included reduced gray matter volume and compromised white matter integrity, which remember is there to protect the gray matter. And that's critical for healthy brain function. That's number two. Not bad enough. Here's number three, increased risk of dementia. The study also found a strong correlation between high UPF intake and increased risk of developing dementia. Those that consumed the most UPFs were more likely to be diagnosed with various forms of dementia. There are many, as you know, including Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's not the only one. There are many dementias. And number four, which may be underlying a lot of this, inflammation and oxidative stress. The researchers pointed out that UPFs contribute to chronic inflammation and oxidative stress, both of which we know, right? We've known this for a long time, are detrimental to brain health. So these conditions can damage brain cells and disrupt the neural pathways. That's why both the white matter and the gray matter are affected. And it leads to cognitive impairment. So here is what they said. I said it's going to be a little longer. Here's a quote. I haven't done this in a long time. Here's the quote. We found that increased consumption of UPFs was associated with a higher risk of both stroke and cognitive impairment. And the association between UPFs and stroke was greater, unfortunately, among Black participants. These associations were independent of demographic, clinical, and behavioral risk factors and other dietary patterns previously associated with each of these outcomes. So they say our findings support the hypothesis that, and this is in bold, the degree of food processing plays an important role in overall brain health and provides complementary information to other recommended dietary patterns. So last but not least, here is a very recent study, just a couple of months ago, and it was in the edition of Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology, that shows a link, it's a strong link actually, between UPFs and bowel effects in US adults. The researchers showed that the consumption of UPF and minimally processed food, either that or minimally, is linked to higher or lower odds of what? Constipation. The effect of food processing being independent of diet quality had nothing to do with diet quality. It has everything to do with UPF or minimally processed food. The study included over 12,000, close to 13,000 adults, of which there were 1,300 and 10,000 that had constipation and diarrhea, respectively. So they had a whole bunch of them in that group. The increased consumption of ultra-processed food was associated with more than 2 times the increased odds of constipation. And that association held after adjusting for all kinds of things, diet quality, water intake, fiber intake, it didn't matter. It was the ultra-processed food that did it. Conversely, an increased take of minimally processed food was associated with reduced odds of constipation. And the changes were quite precise. You substitute 10% of UPF with an equivalent proportion of minimally processed food, and guess what happens? There's a 10% lower odds of constipation, a direct relationship. They noted that neither minimally or ultra-processed food consumption was associated with increased odds of diarrhea, just as an added issue. But for constipation, clear. So I'm hitting you over the head with a number of these things to make the main point. North American Western diets need to get off this train. And the sooner we get off the train of ultra processed foods, the sooner our collective health is going to get better.
I couldn't agree more. It's really powerful data, slightly disturbing, but also maybe hope inspiring if we reframe it a little bit. And it's that type of data you can't unsee it, right? Like once you hear this, you can't unhear it, you can't unsee it.
There.
Now it's gonna hopefully inspire some dietary change. So certainly thank you to everybody for submitting your questions. They're very important to help us all learn and grow together. And thank you to Dr. Gonchor for this great breakdown. And now we can jump into today's study all about obesity reversal using mitochondria targeting drugs.
So let's discuss trying to somehow reverse obesity, in this case, using mitochondria targeting drugs. And this is an article that actually came out about 3 or 4 months ago. So remember, we always talk about recent articles. And in this study, they say there are possible new way to treat obesity and some of the related disorders by targeting the mitochondria. And it's demonstrated by a specific class of drugs that block mitochondrial function, resulting in a reversal of diet-induced obesity, fatty liver, and diabetes. When I see those three together, I want to read that study. So the context, as you know, many decades of research have been targeting mitochondria in the treatment of obesity. So it isn't new that we think that this may be important. But most methodologies are based on the use of drugs like metformin, which we know for people who are getting a diabetes drugs, and metformin inhibits oxidative phosphorylation. And oxidative phosphorylation, or OXPHOS, is the way in which the mitochondria normally work. In mammalian mitochondria, it plays a key role in transducing energy from ingested nutrients. And it works off glucose, etc. And the mitochondria go through a chain in which they produce ATP. Metformin, we know, is an anti-diabetic medication. It's known as a mild complex 1 inhibitor. And we also know that it protects against cancer. So metformin, for all those who use it or have heard about it, is a very well-known drug. So that's the way it's been utilized normally. But we're not talking about this particular drug today. Mitochondrial metabolism can be reprogrammed to support both catabolic and anabolic reactions, depending on physiological demands and disease states. So we know that we can change the way the mitochondria work in the cell. So let's see what happens if you rewire the mitochondria, because we know that rewiring mitochondrial metabolism is intricately linked to metabolic disease. And also it can promote tumor growth. So it can be very, very powerful. So in this study, they started by wanting to look at what happens if you want to treat cancer. And they developed a highly specific group of drug candidates that block mitochondrial function. And by doing that, cellular energy production. What did they actually do? Well, the treatment orally was to male obese mice. So this is a mouse model, and they had been fed a high-fat diet. So 4 weeks of treatment with this particular drug, there was an unexpected increase in fat metabolism, which they weren't expecting. They thought it would just, the fat would come in and be deposited. But in fact, what happened is there was an increase in fat metabolism. And that resulted in a drastic weight loss, not weight gain, but weight loss. And not only that, but also a reduction in the amount of fat accumulation in the liver. You would normally expect that fat would accumulate in the liver on a very high fat diet, but it didn't. And it restored glucose tolerance, which, if you remember, is one of the hallmarks of metabolic syndrome, which is what you see in pre-diabetics and diabetics. So it was just the opposite of what they were expecting. So they had a demonstration here that this oral treatment with an inhibitor of mitochondrial transcription, and I'll explain that in a minute, shifts the whole animal metabolism away from glucose towards fatty acid oxidation, which leads to a rapid normalization of body weight. It also reverses hepatosteatosis. Remember, I told you there isn't fat accumulating, it's actually decreasing fat in the liver and restoring normal glucose tolerance. So they said that this inhibitor of mitochondrial transcription has beneficial metabolic effects that cause decreased weight of the mice on a high fat diet of all things without affecting the food intake. So these mice were eating the food, good intake, high fat, and yet they were losing weight. They also were having the same kind of physical activity, etc. So decreased oxygen phosphorylation protein levels and impaired OXPHOS activities in the liver, but not in the other organs, is consistent with accumulation of this inhibitor of mitochondrial transcription in the liver. So what does that mean? What they actually were doing is they were giving a drug that is stopping the ability of the cells to utilize the normal mitochondrial function of bringing in oxygen and creating ATP. Instead of that, they inhibited that, and they allowed fatty acids to take over as a way of creating energy. And by doing that, of course, you decreased fat and weight. So the hypothesis is with this inhibitor of mitochondrial transcription, this treatment leads to a metabolic reprogramming in the liver that shifts the balance of dehydrogenases that deliver electrons to the normal pool that is needed for energy creation in the mitochondria, thereby, in doing that, favoring fatty acid oxidation over glucose and oxygen. So the present study strongly suggests that this kind of IMT treatment, this inhibition treatment, in the mice who are on a high-fat diet increases fatty acid oxidation in the liver. And they're looking at future studies with isotope-labeled substrates in isolated liver cells. They're going to look directly at isolated liver cells, or even in whole animals, to see whether they can validate this particular observation. And here's a quote from this study. They said they're very excited to have identified a new potential strategy for treating common diseases like obesity and type 2 diabetes, which is very important. And I just want to remind you that this all goes with the stuff we know, because we look at obesity, inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction. All of this stuff comes together. If you have an excess of food with nutrients, mainly saturated fatty acids, you know what you normally do? You normally will create mitochondrial dysfunction, which is going to lead to increased ROS. And that leads to inflammation and the other way around as well. Those are reactive oxygen species. That's not what you want in the cell. You want to constantly decrease that. But if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, what does it do? It decreases the activity of antioxidant enzymes, which would normally be there to try to decrease ROS. And because of that, you damage lipids, proteins, and of course, DNA. And what does that lead to? Well, eventually it leads to apoptosis, which is destruction of the cell. The cell kills itself, which is not what you want. And remember, when you have an excess of saturated fatty acids and inflammation, what are you doing? You're making changes in the cell, activation of TLR4, which is an inflammatory change, endoplasmic reticulum stress, meaning the cell cannot function properly, macrophage infiltration in adipose tissue. It starts destroying those cells. And of course, the release of inflammatory mediators, which you don't want, IL-6, IL-1 beta, etc. All of those things happen. These are things you do not want. So there we are.
Wonderful presentation. I get excited about this kind of stuff where, there could be these new treatments, because a lot of these mechanisms, the oxidative stress and inflammation, it's this, compounding effect, this sort of vicious cycle that can be, self-perpetuating in a lot of ways. And so I think this is where I picture this world where we use FDN and dress foundations, plus maybe some of these new therapies to help them break out of that cycle while we work on all of those lifestyle foundations. So I just
You're
think
right.
it amazing research.
You're absolutely right. And remember, this is taking place at the same time that GLP-1s have
Mm,
become the meme worldwide, right?
mm,
Just take a GLP-1, get, every week, just inject yourself and you're going to lose weight. Well, it's true, but there's got to be more to it than that.
mm,
And what this study is saying is, wait a second, hold it. We got to go back and again look at the mitochondria. What is going on in that cell? And if we can decrease the inflammation, reactive oxygen species, and we can do it through diets, we can do it through all the things you mentioned that FDN does, yes, that is a major way of being able to decrease overweight, obesity, and diabetes, metabolic syndrome.
I couldn't agree more. I'm glad I almost mentioned Ozempic and the GLP-1s and everything. I'm glad you mentioned it, right? We have to make sure we build the foundation, add those in on top. So amazing presentation. And to the audience, make sure subscribe, like, share this episode. I'm sure you know somebody that should hear it, needs to hear it. And make sure also too, you can submit your questions, comments, or suggested topics of what you would like to see us discuss at fdntraining.com/science matters. And you can also grab a copy of the studies and slides at fdntraining.com/studies. And don't forget to join us in 2 weeks on September 4th, when we'll talk about early antibiotic-driven dysbiosis and later asthma. Because, my friends,
Science matters.